Chapter 4, You Saw Mom Again? It had taken the better part of a week, but Caleb was feeling pretty good about the way his room was set up for studying now. Taking the advice from Video A3 that his older self had directed him to, he had spent the time setting up the best possible study place. He was surprised that there were so many practical yet fairly easy to change things that made such an improvement. Leaning back, he glanced around. There had been a lot of changes in a week. A hunt in the attic had scored an old desk lamp. With the addition of an LED light bulb, it was nice and bright. He also had an actual desk now. Well, sort of. It was the old kitchen door from before the last renovation. It formed a desk surface when it was put across two short filing cabinets. His dad had set him up with leftover paint and brushes, along with putty and sandpaper. The putty and sanding had gotten rid of the hinge and handle holes, and the paint had given it a nice glossy surface. After a few hours he had a great desk surface. His new desk was the same color as the kitchen cabinets, but he didn't mind. The chair he leaned back on was another great find in the attic. It was his dad's old office chair. Scratched up and torn but fully adjustable for height. With the addition of a horse blanket from another attic box, he was good to go. Looking down at the fringed edges, he let his mind wander. Walls disappeared and the roof vaporized. He was riding a beautiful chestnut stallion at a brisk trot up the side of a grassy hill. As he crested the top of the hill, he could see snow-covered mountains in the distance. What an incredible scene, he thought, as he continued down into the valley. Stopping for a break to let his horse drink from the rushing creek, he wiped his brow and glanced skyward. The sun was high, and he felt his face reddening. Wait a moment. It's not the sun. It's the new LED bulb in the ceiling fixture of my room. Caleb realized with a start. He forced himself back to reality and continued to look at what was new in his room. The map on the wall, the large calendar, and the charts of science and math formulas looked down on his desk area. His school bag hung on a hook off the edge of his desk. Textbooks were neatly piled next to his notebooks. His new dictionary sat open, along with an accompanying thesaurus. They were gifts from his dad, who had been really happy to see the changes Caleb was making. In an old, chipped coffee cup, his pen and pencil collection had been gathered. His ruler and a math set sat next to an open agenda book with his homework listed. He was proud of the work he'd done to prepare his workspace and was excited to continue with the lessons his older self had laid out for him. Caleb paused and thought back to the way his room used to look. Gone were the piles of books, papers and dirty dishes on his bedstand and chair. The floor that once had scattered pens, pencils, old snack wrappers and laundry strewn around was now tidy. Gone as well were the board game boxes that had been piled on the end of his bed. His dartboard, that used to be prominently displayed on the outside of the closet door, had been moved to the inside of the closet, out of sight and less distracting for when he studied. Everything was in its place. Areas were well organized. Finally, he turned, and his eyes fell on the Do Not Disturb sign hanging on a slightly open door. Oh no. He sighed, realizing his mind had wandered again. He was supposed to be doing his homework. Taking a deep breath and shaking his head, he pulled his chair up to his new desk while attempting to refocus. This homework is not going to do itself. Unless, maybe, in the future that will be possible, he pondered. I really need to ask my older self. His mind was off again in a new direction. His attention gone yet again. Wouldn't that be good, he thought. He closed his eyes and saw himself leaning back, feet up, watching his pens and pencils, directed by unseen hands, finishing up all of his assignments in rapid and record time. Caleb sighed as he caught his mind wandering again. Clearly there's much more to concentrating than just setting up my room, he mused. Looks like it's time for the second part of the concentration lesson. A voice behind him boomed. Startled, he lifted his head and pivoted his chair. Behind him, his older self and father stood beaming at the door. His father had the same slight smile on his face that he'd had at dinner the week before when Caleb had first met his older self. He didn't seem at all alarmed that there was suddenly two of his son in the room. Watching his reaction, his older self laughed. Perhaps Dad has some explaining to do before we continue with what you need to know next. I suppose I do, his dad began. Son, I've been waiting for this time ever since your older self visited your mother and I when you were only 7 years old. By our time, that was 5 years ago. Your older self told me he would be back, but I wasn't sure when. When my partners and I at UBC decided I would be going back to visit my younger self, we agreed it would be best to warn our parents ahead of time. The thought was that this should be done a couple of months ahead of the planned visit, but I asked to go back several years further so that I could see Mom again, Caleb's older self explained. By my time frame, that was just the week before last, so it didn't affect our research window at all. Besides, it allowed Dad time to read about time travel and introduce you to some books and movies that discussed some of those concepts, so you'd be receptive to me popping in. Wait, you're saying that only 2 weeks ago you visited with Dad and that Mom was there? Caleb choked, his voice catching in his throat as emotions welled from within, driven by the thought of seeing his mom again. Absolutely, his older self breathed, smiling broadly at the look on Caleb's face. Wow, so you saw Mom again. How was she? He gasped again, his face giving away the emotions he felt. His eyes were moist as he continued to feel the lump in his throat. She was as great as we remember her, Caleb, his older self sighed. Can I go see her? Caleb asked, his mind already preparing for the trip as a tear rolled down his cheek. It was quickly wiped away, but not before his dad and older self noticed. Well, sadly, no, Caleb. I can jump from here back to the future time, but I can't take you with me. I can only travel out and back from the University of British Columbia Time Lab. They maintain a lock on my position and my unique body DNA is coded into the computer system. As far as we know, we're only able to travel through the time periods that have already occurred before the time period we live in. That's why I can visit you here, and folks from further in the future can visit to my time, but I wouldn't be able to visit a time period farther in the future, he continued. You'll have to get to the future in the time-honored process of living one day at a time. You have some unique knowledge, though. You know that if you work hard, and follow all the suggestions we give you, that not only will you fulfill all your dreams, but you will also get to see Mom again. He smiled. Wow, that's something, Caleb's dad stammered. I'd love to see your mom again. Now it was his dad's turn to get choked up. He fought to keep a calm face, but tears welled up in his eyes. Actually, you will, Caleb's older self responded. After the first visit 2 weeks ago, your older self in the future found out where and when I had been. You will be so set on visiting I won't be able to say no. The university was still experimenting, so we got the okay to try a second visit. You and I actually went back one more time to a point just a day after my first visit. We saw Caleb, Mom and your younger self. You were way too nervous to make contact though, so we just watched from a bit of a distance. You weren't sure how our mom, or your younger self would react. And probably best. There are a lot of things we aren't allowed to change or influence when visiting from the future. And you didn't think you could get through an actual meeting without some accidental reference to Mom's coming illness. We were such a happy family, you didn't want them to know what was coming. Really? Oh my gosh. Caleb's dad choked, a smile beginning to play on his lips. You know, your mom and I thought we saw you that next day, when we were at the park. You didn't approach us though, so we thought we had imagined it. You were also with that older gentleman. Who was you? His older self laughed. I suppose that makes a certain kind of sense now, but it is a little difficult to get my head around. Unbelievable, his dad continued. Well, I can hardly wait. His dad paused, overwhelmed by the thought of seeing his wife again. Words would not come. Caleb, as well as his older self, were affected by the emotion of the moment. All three of them fought to control their tears, mostly unsuccessfully. It was a moment before any of them spoke. Finally, Caleb's dad broke the strained silence. But now, just to be clear, all of this is dependent on Caleb here learning all the strategies and tips to be successful so that he can help make the discoveries for time travel to be possible. Got that right, Dad, his older self retorted. Caleb's got work to do. Both his dad and his older self turned to look at him. Talk about pressure, he thought, then summoning up all of the stored energy from the exciting things he had just learned, he blurted out, well, time's being wasted here, let's get on with this. Both his dad and his older self laughed, and his older self pulled up a stool and sat down next to him at the desk. No time like the present, his older self proclaimed. It so happened that the humor in that last statement struck them all at exactly the same moment, and they laughed and laughed. An hour and a half later, Caleb felt quite comfortable with knowing that he could control and focus his concentration by overcoming many of his internal distractions. Once Caleb got into addressing them, he felt things flowed very well. As he noted each of his concerns, he could feel that he was already halfway to making them better. He was starting to get used to having his older self answer and comment on his every concern. After all, Caleb was totally assured that not only did his older self know what he was talking about, he had also actually experienced every step of it. By the end of their session, Caleb was already starting to formulate solutions that would help him deal with his concerns. These steps were sure to improve his control over his internal distractions. Later, when Caleb was alone at his desk, he thought back to all the new information he had taken in about his family and time travel. It really was amazing and exciting. He sure had an incredible life to look forward to. With that reflection, his eyes fell on the screen of his laptop computer. Just enough time to review what I've learned by watching the video from the web portal, he reasoned, glancing at his watch. His older self had mentioned that Caleb would come to know that the time just before sleep was actually great for reviewing things that a person really wanted to remember. Something about the mind visiting and revisiting the information during sleep. Sounds good to me, he murmured, turning his attention to the computer screen.